Hi, welcome to the Puppy Noir edition of the Bathtub. We're welcoming Lucky here for a special Puppy Noir discussion. That's because, of course, hard-boiled, two-fisted, gal-loving, uh, bourbon-drinking detectives and puppies tend to go together very well. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's not talked. It's one of those things that's never talked about in literature courses. But puppies and hard-boiled detectives, they're like this. Okay. They're like pigs and pancakes, whatever it is like that. Okay, well, there's Lucky. She's here to just introduce Dashiell Hammett, one of her favorite writers and one of my favorite writers. And I'm going to put her back because she's being remarkably good. You see that face? You can't even see her eyes because her eyes just pure like big black pupils and this big black furry face. And I can't even tell if her eyes are open or not. Look at that; they're wide open. Anyway. That's the puppy noir. That's the puppy part of the puppy noir. Hon? Hon? There you go. Where's my assistant? There you go. Yeah? Okay. Sorry, you just can't get good help. I'm telling you. Our production values suck on this show. We're talking about Dashiell Hammett. We started talking about him last week. We were talking about Joe Gorza's really fun homage to Dashiell Hammett called Hammett. And now we're talking about Hammett. Oh, look at this. I can't even. This is a terrible show, I got to tell you. I've got my shirt buttoned. This week, the only Dashiell Hammett book that I can't remember reading before is The Big Knockover, which is just one of the large anthologies of long stories that Hammett wrote. Hammett wrote for Black Masks in the 20s and 30s. Don't quote me on anything, but roughly 20s and 30s, wrote lots of long novelettes. They're all about 40 or 50 pages. They're almost always featuring the Continental Op, the nameless detective who is always, the hard-hitting, tough-talking guy who goes around solving crimes, who's sort of based on Hammett's years in the Pinkerton service. So Pinkertons were a big, horrible company, group of detectives they were union busters for the big corporations, and Hammett did not have fond feelings about his years of the Pinkertons, but he uses his experience to write all these fabulous, fun stories. And his best stuff is really these novelettes. I think that he's best known for his novels, but he was always writing these terrific these novelettes. And this was a really fun one, The Big Knockover. I really recommend going back and getting this one. There's another terrific collection of his Continental Op stories called The Continental Op. These are the old vintage editions. Again, I don't believe in trade paperbacks. You have to have the old mass market editions. This is a lovely edition for various reasons. One is it has Lillian Hellman's introduction. And I was just sort of glancing around at the information. I don't know much about Lillian Hellman. I love the introduction she writes about her years with Hammett. It's a really affectionate, strong, beautifully written a piece about Hammett. And I just managed to lose my place that I was going to read you from. But her picture of her years with this guy who was self-taught, who was a hugely successful writer in the 20s and 30s, and then faded for like the last 20 years of his life due to illness and alcoholism. Clearly a serious drinker. Drinking is a huge part of his stories and his books. It's also a huge part of the Hammett novel by Joe Gorza. The little bits and pieces I was picking up is that Hellman spent a lot of her life after Hammett died writing about their relationship, and apparently many people, especially Mary McCarthy, says that almost everything she said was a lie. I think Mary McCarthy was famous for saying that everything in Lillian Hellman's memoirs about Hammett was a lie, including the and, the or, and the but. Everything she said was a lie. I don't know if that's true, but she has these nice little pictures of what Hammett was like. And I thought I'd read just a little passage. And she's talking about his obsession with reading and reading books. The hit and miss reading, the picking up of any book, made for a remarkable mind, neat, accurate, respectful of fact. He took a strong and lasting dislike to a man who insisted mackerel were related to herring. And once he left my living room when a famous writer talked without much knowledge of existentialism, refusing to come down to dinner with the writer because he said, he's the greatest waste of time since the Parcheesi board, Liars are bores. A neighbor once rang up to ask him how to stop a leak in a swimming pool, and he knew. My farmer's son asked him how to make a trap for snapping turtles, and he knew. Born a Maryland Catholic, but having long ago left the church, he knew more about Judaism than I did, and more about New Orleans music, food, and architecture than my father, who had grown up there. Once I wanted to know about early glassmaking for windows and was headed for the encyclopedia, but Hammett told me before I got there. He knew the varieties of seaweed, and for a month he studied the cross-pollination of corn, and for many, many months tried plasma physics. It was more than reading. It was a man at work. It's just a lovely essay about Hammett. All the stories are fun in here. The opening, the gutting of Kufignal, I'm pronouncing it wrong, is about some wealthy island that's invaded by kidnappers. It's got a little trick to it. The Scorched Face is a really good one. It's a very strange. Some of these are very dark, almost Weird Tales type stories. And then there's the one that's Dead Yellow Women is the references to Asian women. And it goes into Chinatown, San Francisco's Chinatown, and treats it almost like a Weird Tales landscape. It's these bizarre pictures of these hidden warrens of criminal activity, and it's great fun. It's great pleasure to read these stories. I thought while we're at it, I poured myself a martini so I could be a tough talking detective, hard noir discusser here. And of course, I only have the glass my wife will let me keep, which has roses all over it. So it kind of destroys the whole effect, doesn't it? But imagine that's just a clear glass, and we're in a speakeasy somewhere, and it doesn't have flowers all over the thing. I wanted to go through most of the Hammett I read when I was 14 or 15 years old. I read almost all of Hammett and almost all of Chandler when I was about 15. I just loved all these books. And I thought I'd just go. I haven't read them since, many of them. What my favorite, if I went back over the old ones and was recommending to go off and read some Hammett, is Red Harvest. This is the Continental Op again, I believe. Yes, it is. And the gimmick is that he goes into a town that's run by criminals. There's just 2 or 3 criminal gangs. And he wants to destroy these criminal gangs, and he does it by setting them against each other. And it's just I just remember loving this book. And you start reading it, you have no idea. And he just figures these different ways to turn these and he's sort of anonymous. You never hear his interior thoughts. He just sort of tries to do what he thinks is the right thing to do. And if you're going to read one, I would definitely say this is the first one to go to, is Red Harvest, rather than the famous one, which is The Maltese Falcon. One of my all-time favorite books. It was also the basis, if I'm wrong, it's the basis for Yojimbo, one of the all-time great Kurosawa films, with the perfect Continental Op, by the way. It's Toshiro Mifune. It's hilarious and just great in that. And it's the same thing. We have the samurai comes into town and tries to turn all the bad guys against each other. Great book. Yojimbo's great. And uncredited, I think, but if you look at Yojimbo, one of the movies that is a clear ripoff of Yojimbo is Fistful of Dollars, the Clint Eastwood movie. Sergio Leone's great early Western, a spaghetti Western. And that's definitely a ripoff of some sort of Red Harvest. I think they actually made a version of Red Harvest with Bruce Willis, I want to say, which is not very good. Another one I really loved was The Glass Key. I liked all the Hammett I ever read. The Glass Key there's a similarity to Red Harvest, and I'm going to argue that I'm not a big fan of the Coen brother movies. They were okay. I know don't even tell me. I know a lot of you love Coen brothers. I find Coen brothers always a little disappointing. And their big movie, one of the big hit movies, was Miller's Crossing. And I couldn't watch it because it was so clearly an homage, if not a ripoff. I don't know where the line is between a ripoff and an homage to The Glass Key. And the premise of a guy trying to help his buddy who's a criminal. And there's in the old black and white film, I believe it's Alan Ladd and William Bendix, I want to say. Again, I'm not checking this stuff out. But it's a great black and white old noir. It's much better than Miller's Crossing. The Glass Key by itself, though, is another terrific read. And it's about a guy trying to help his buddy who's a criminal, and there's kind of all these gangland activities. And I can't remember better than that. I don't remember The Dane Curse. It's Continental Op again, and I think it's a fix-up. A fix-up is when a writer does lots of novelettes like Hammett did for the magazines, and then tries to kind of put them together into a novel. The greatest all-time fix-up is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, where he takes all these stories and puts them together into a book. There's the Maltese Falcon, one of all-time great movies. I saw the movie so many times as a kid and as a grown-up, and they take the dialogue basically out of the book and make this terrific black and white film with the perfect cast. And when I actually finally tried to read the whole book myself, and I found it a little boring. Maybe I was just because the film is just such a terrific abstraction of all the great stuff. And finally, no one can read The Thin Man and not have a great time. I dare you to be bored reading The Thin Man. It's a hilarious book. It's his last novel. He really goes through a long period where he doesn't write much near the end of his life, and he even goes back into the military, I think. The Thin Man is basically about two drinkers. And if you see the movies, the old black and white movies are a lot of fun with William Powell and Myrna Loy, I believe. And it's almost all dialogue. And it's just these two people going out and going to fancy parties, getting drunk, making jokes with each other, and then they solve crimes along the way. It is a really fun book. And I remember staying up all night when I was like 15 and reading this and passing this on to my mom, and just everyone read it, laughed. And you read this before, it's much better than the movie. Then there's a whole series of Thin Man movies, which I found pretty disappointing, except for the first 15 minutes. The first 15 minutes of all the other after The Thin Man goes to the races, The Thin Man goes Waikiki. There's a whole bunch of those movies, and I recall not being able to get through them, but the beginnings were always very fun. Anyway, you can't go wrong with Hammett. I really recommend any of these books. The only one I read recently was just the catching up with The Big Knockover and other stories. But if I was to give you two choices, I would say definitely read you should read Red Harvest for just the hard-boiled, Thin Man for the laughs. Glass Key is a pretty satisfying book all around, I think. I'll try to reread those in the bathtub soon. Okay, thanks for coming for the Puppy Noir edition. And we can't do the Puppy Noir stuff for very long because the dog's growing so fast that we can't do so much noir as we might want to. We may have to have full-grown dog noir, which may be the next genre we tackle. All right, happy reading in the bathtub.